That evening, when every gaze in the luxurious room was fixed on Vanessa, my so-called perfect sister, I could only stand quietly in a corner, my trembling hand clutching the worn envelope the lawyer had just handed me. Vanessa was declared the sole heir to the entire $18 million empire. The mansion, the yacht, the supercars, the company shares, everything was listed clearly in the will. Applause of congratulations and murmurs of admiration rose like a cold chorus. And me, the child always treated as an outsider, was left with a dusty envelope so thin that everyone assumed it contained nothing more than a meaningless scrap of paper. As I slipped away, mocking laughter still chased after me. That night, in my cramped apartment, I finally dared to open the envelope. What I discovered inside would not only change my life forever, but also expose the darkest secrets of the Carter family. Have you ever been dismissed by the entire world, only to realize that you were the one holding the real key all along? And before we uncover this secret together, I want to ask, where are you watching this story from, and at what time? Hi, my name is Isabel Carter, and I am 29 years old. When people hear the Carter name, they probably imagine I was born into luxury, cradled in the affection of a wealthy dynasty. But the truth could not be further from that. I am the illegitimate child, the one never wanted, the stain on the legacy of a powerful bloodline. I can still recall my mother's face, Laura Miller, though the memory is faint, fragmented like old reels of film. She died when I was only 3 years old in a car accident. Everyone insisted was just unfortunate. Yet, even as a child, I sensed something sinister behind her death. I remember that night vividly, the adults whispering in hushed tones, Eleanor sitting coldly on the living room sofa, and Richard Carter, my father, silently smoking until dawn without uttering a single word. After my mother's death, I was brought to live in the Carter estate in Rhode Island. To the world, that grand mansion was a symbol of power and luxury, but to me, it felt like a gilded prison. Eleanor, Richard's lawful wife and Vanessa's mother, quickly asserted her control over everything, including my very existence. She never allowed me to call her stepmother. Each time I slipped and said the word, her eyes would narrow, her teeth clenched. "Don't you ever give me that title. You are not my child. You are nothing but a burden." From that moment, I understood that in this house spanning thousands of square feet, I had no rightful place. Vanessa, my half-sister, was the complete opposite. 5 years older than me, she was raised by Eleanor as a little queen. From an early age, Vanessa was enrolled in exclusive ballet classes, horseback riding lessons, and given a Steinway piano placed proudly in the center of the living room. Whenever there was a family photo, Vanessa was always positioned in the center, draped in elegant dresses, while I was forbidden from even approaching the camera. This is the image of the Carter family, not a playground for outsiders. Eleanor would say coldly whenever I lingered at the doorway, watching the picture of a family I could never be part of. My room was never a family member's bedroom, but the maid's quarters in the basement, cramped and dark, with an old wooden bed that creaked every time I turned. While Vanessa had an entire suite of rooms filled with imported toys and custom-made princess dresses from Paris, I was given hand-me-down books and clothes from the household staff. I still remember one winter evening, when the family sat at the long, candlelit dining table. I was forced to eat in the kitchen with the servants simply because Eleanor didn't want the image of the Carter dinner table tainted. I was only 7 years old then, too young to fully understand the weight of that humiliation, only able to swallow my tears along with a bowl of cold, watery soup. What hurt the most was not the lack of material comfort, but the erasure of my existence. My name was never called at family gatherings, never introduced to friends or business partners. To the outside world, Isabel Carter did not exist. Richard, my father, though not as openly hostile as Eleanor, kept his distance. He rarely spoke to me, and every time his eyes fell on me, there was a flicker of something unspoken. Part pity, part fear, and something that almost resembled guilt. But he never stepped beyond that cold, invisible barrier to protect me. Vanessa grew up bathed in absolute favoritism. She was taught from the start that she was the rightful heir, the future of Carter Industries. Every one of her achievements, no matter how minor, was magnified by Eleanor, while mine, no matter how hard I worked, were never acknowledged. I remember once in elementary school I won a statewide science award for a small solar energy project. I brought the certificate home, my heart leaping at the thought that maybe, just maybe, my father would smile. But Eleanor only glanced at it, then tossed the paper into the trash with a bitter remark. Don't delude yourself into thinking a worthless piece of paper can change your place. Vanessa simply stood there smirking, showing off the new shoes Eleanor had just bought her from Milan. That was my childhood full of invisible cuts. I slowly learned to retreat inward, finding small pockets of joy where I could, reading in the abandoned library behind the mansion, sketching on old scraps of paper, and sometimes imagining another life where I wasn't considered the extra. But whenever I returned to reality, Eleanor's cold stare, Vanessa's mocking laugh, and my father's heavy silence reminded me that dream was nothing but a fantasy. By the time I emerged from that shadowed childhood, I knew the only way to survive was to rely on myself. No one in the Carter family gave me a single coin or a helping hand. Everything I would later achieve began with scholarships I earned through relentless effort. I still remember the moment I received my college acceptance letter with a full scholarship. My hands shook as I realized this was my ticket out of that mansion, away from Eleanor's contempt and Vanessa's sneers. On the day I left, no one came to see me off. Eleanor even announced in front of guests, "Finally, that burden has left my house." The words cut like a final knife, but at the same time, they became the very fuel for the vow I made to myself. I would never return in a position of weakness. My college years were a relentless stretch of studying and working without pause. I took shifts at a coffee shop, at the library, and squeezed in small interior design projects for friends to earn extra money. I discovered that I had an instinct for seeing space differently, creating harmony between light, color, and objects. That became the starting point for the path I would later choose. After graduation, I scraped together every dollar, borrowed a little more from a research grant, and rented a tiny room in Brooklyn to start my own interior design company. Back then, the company was just me, an old desk, and a laptop that had seen too many years. But to me, it was everything a dream of owning my life, free from the Carter family's money or pity. While I was busy with small contracts designing studio apartments, coffee shops, or classrooms for elementary schools on the other side of the world, Vanessa and Eleanor were gracing the covers of society magazines. They were the center of glittering Manhattan parties, where diamond-studded gowns shimmered under chandelier light and expensive French wine glasses clinked in the laughter of the elite. Vanessa was regularly hailed by the press as the perfect heiress, while Eleanor was the powerful advisor behind Carter Industries. They strode confidently through charity galas, posed for photos with top politicians, and shook hands with banking moguls, real estate tycoons, even government officials. Every time I stumbled across their images in newspapers or on television, a strange ache pulsed in my chest, both painful and cold. Once, I had dreamed of being part of that picture. But eventually I realized that world was never meant for me. Richard, my father, was still alive, but the distance between us had never closed. He remained the boss on paper, his name stamped on every major contract, every business headline. But I knew all too well that the true hand steering Carter Industries was not his, but Eleanor's. I once attended a conference as a student and overheard a few businessmen speaking of her with an odd mix of respect and fear. Eleanor Blackwood is the one really in charge. Richard is just the face. I was 19 at the time, sitting in the back row, and those words carved themselves into my memory. They confirmed what I had felt throughout my childhood. Eleanor was not just the mistress of the house, she was the strategist behind every move of the Carter Empire. And me, though I shared the same blood, I remained an outsider. Richard never once called to ask how I was living in New York. Whenever I dared to send a letter sharing small victories like my company completing its first project or being featured in an independent design magazine, he stayed silent. No reply, no sign he even cared. Meanwhile, every step Vanessa took was celebrated, spotlighted, and praised. He proudly stood beside her at events, publicly presenting her as the heir. As for me, he seemed to deliberately keep his distance, as if my very existence were a risk that could unravel everything. New York City was a different kind of battlefield for me. There were no spotlights, no powerful handshakes, only small contracts and the grind of daily effort. I still remember the first evening I signed a contract on my own to renovate a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. The owners were a young couple, and all they wanted was a space that felt neat and warm. I poured my whole heart into every detail, from the choice of paint colors and lighting to the placement of the furniture. When they looked around the finished apartment, the brightness in their eyes gave me a joy no paycheck could ever buy. That was the moment I realized that the path I had chosen, though modest, carried true meaning. But every night, when I returned to my tiny apartment and glanced at my phone screen lit up with images of Vanessa beaming on a new yacht or Eleanor raising a glass with top political figures, I felt the contrast more sharply than ever. Two worlds coexisted, separate, and I was standing at the edge, looking in. On one side was an empire of dazzling wealth and power. On the other, a young woman struggling to lay each brick for her own dream. And deep inside, I could never stop asking myself, why was I excluded? Why, with the same bloodline, was one exalted while the other was buried? That question never had an answer until the night I opened that dusty envelope and touched the truth. The news of my father's death reached me on a bleak autumn morning. I had just stepped out of my small office in Brooklyn when a call came from an unknown number. A rough male voice said, "Richard Carter, he's gone. The funeral will be this weekend." That was it. No words of condolence, no instructions, nothing more. I froze on the sidewalk, yellow leaves scattering around my feet. Though Richard had never truly been a father to me in all those years, the sudden news of his passing from a stroke still struck me with disbelief. Inside me there were no tears, only a heavy emptiness, as if a door had closed forever, one I had never been allowed to walk through. On the day of the funeral, I drove my old Honda, the only thing I had managed to own after years of labor, from New York back to Newport. The battered car looked small and out of place on the paved road leading to the Carter mansion, lined with sleek black limousines, Italian sports cars, and luxury SUVs. When I opened the door and stepped out, the rumble of engines and the click of high heels against marble blended together into a symphony of opulence that had never included me. I spotted Vanessa and Eleanor instantly as they descended from the newest Rolls-Royce, surrounded by a throng of people. Cameras flashed, guests crowded to shake their hands, their voices overflowing with flattery. So well-deserved, the true future of the Carter empire. Eleanor smiled with cold pride, while Vanessa, in a custom black dress, merely nodded as though such adoration were her birthright. I walked into the church where the service was being held and took a seat in the very last row. I didn't dare move forward, knowing full well I wasn't welcome. Throughout the ceremony, Richard was remembered as a brilliant leader, a devoted father, a great businessman. Not a single word was said about me. In their eyes, the Carter family consisted only of Eleanor and Vanessa. When Eleanor's gaze briefly swept over me, I caught that familiar glint of disdain. She didn't need to speak, her eyes alone mocked me. "How dare you even show your face here?" After the funeral, the guests were invited back to the Newport mansion for the reading of the will. The estate, perched on the Rhode Island coastline, loomed like a castle, its towering white marble columns and ivy-covered walls both majestic and unwelcoming. I had spent part of my childhood there, yet every return made me feel like an intruder trespassing on forbidden ground. In the vast grand hall, portraits of Carter ancestors hung in solemn rows, but there was not a single trace of me or my mother. Eleanor sat regally at the center, Vanessa beside her, while I was given a small chair at the edge, an observer, nothing more. Mr. Finch, the middle-aged lawyer with a stern, weary look, stood to read the will. His voice echoed through the chamber. The entirety of Richard Carter's tangible and intangible assets, including estates, yachts, company shares, and properties totaling $18 million, shall be transferred to his daughter, Vanessa Carter. Applause and murmurs of approval spread across the room. Vanessa smiled in satisfaction, lifting her chin like a queen ascending her throne. Eleanor rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes glittering with pride and triumph. I sat in silence, my heart pounding so hard it was difficult to breathe. $18 million, a figure beyond anything I could imagine, yet it didn't surprise me. I had expected this outcome, because all my life I had never truly been considered part of the family. But Finch wasn't finished. He turned another page, then paused, his voice lowering. In addition, Richard Carter left a message. The entire room went quiet. Finch read slowly, each word deliberate. Blood defines lineage, but character defines worth. You will receive exactly what you deserve. I felt dozens of eyes fall on me. Finch stepped forward and placed an old envelope into my hands, its edges yellowed as if it had been locked away for years. My fingers trembled as I took it, while a ripple of chuckles spread through the room. Vanessa burst into open laughter. Oh God, a dusty envelope. Isabel, do you really think Father left you anything? It's probably just an old Christmas card. The guests around her broke into laughter as well, some covering their mouths, though their eyes betrayed their ridicule. Eleanor didn't laugh as loudly as her daughter, but she leaned toward me, whispering with venom only I could hear. Exactly where you belong, nothing but dust. I bit down hard on my lip, my hand clutching the envelope so tightly the paper crumpled at the edges. I wanted to fight back, to shout that they could not keep me cast aside forever, but my throat locked. In that grand hall, surrounded by glittering gowns and expensive suits, I was nothing more than a small shadow, humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses. When the reading of the will ended, Vanessa was surrounded by people congratulating her as if she had just been crowned. I quietly rose, clutching the envelope to my chest, and left the mansion. As I passed through the grand doors, the ocean wind lashed against my face, cold and sharp, yet it couldn't cool the fire of humiliation burning in my chest. I walked past the rows of gleaming luxury cars until I reached my old Honda. The door creaked as I opened it, but at least it was the one space no one could take from me. I sat behind the wheel, my hands trembling, my mind in chaos. My entire life had been a lesson in exclusion, but never had I been publicly humiliated like this. I turned the key. The weak sputter of the engine rose like a bitter reminder of the distance between me and that other world. I arrived back in Brooklyn late at night. The small street where I lived was so quiet I could hear the wind slipping through the window cracks and a cat meowing faintly from the roof across the way. I sat down on the rickety wooden chair at my kitchen table, the yellow light casting blotched shadows on the walls. In my hands was still the old envelope, the thing everyone had mocked, dismissed as a cruel joke during the will reading. I turned it over under the lamp, feeling as if I were holding a secret no one cared to notice but me. I drew a long breath and gently opened the envelope. Inside was not an old Christmas card, nor some meaningless scrap of paper. There was only a thin sheet typed in terse lines, Zurich Liberty Bank. Account number 764291XXXX. This is for the child who was never supposed to exist. Your mother knew why. I read the words again and again, my head spinning. The child who was never supposed to exist, the phrase stabbed straight into my heart. All these years I had grown used to being overlooked, treated as an afterthought, but never had I seen the truth laid out in black and white like this. And, your mother knew why. Why would my father write that? Why bring up my mother, gone since I was 3, as if she held all the answers? My hands shook as I opened my old laptop. I typed the bank's name into the browser, and Zurich Liberty Bank appeared with its sleek, cold interface. I entered the account number, along with a small password printed at the bottom of the paper. My heart pounded wildly, each beat threatening to explode in my chest. The screen spun for a few seconds, then the number appeared. I froze, unable to believe my eyes. $127 million. $127 million. I sank back into my chair, breath coming fast and uneven. For a moment, the entire little apartment seemed to tilt around me. I looked around the room, the peeling walls, the old refrigerator rattling in the corner, the secondhand table and chairs from a thrift shop, and then back at the glaring number on the screen. The contrast was so stark I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Part of me wanted to scream, to call someone and share it, but then I realized I had no one. No family member, no close friend near enough for me to tell that I had just discovered a fortune beyond imagination. It was only me, sitting in my small apartment, holding the biggest secret of my life. And, at the same time, a massive question rose inside me. Why had my father left this money to me? And why not to Vanessa, the daughter the whole world assumed to be the rightful heir? If Richard had only wanted me to stay silent, he could have ignored me as he always had. If he wanted to punish Eleanor, he had an entire will to do it publicly. So why this hidden way, leaving me only an old envelope with that haunting message? I wondered if this was just another cruel trick from Eleanor. But no, the typewritten words were too precise, the tone far too personal. This was undoubtedly from Richard. And that sum couldn't be fake. I tried transferring a small amount, exactly $500, into my own personal account. Within seconds, the balance appeared in my US bank, proof that the Zurich account was real. I sat frozen, my hands clutching my head. $127 million. It wasn't a gift. It was a burden, a vast mystery laced with a responsibility I wasn't yet ready to carry. I thought of the message again. Your mother knew why. My mother, Laura Miller, the woman whose memory in my mind lived only in faint scraps, a light trace of perfume, the soft hum of a lullaby, her arms holding me on cold nights. Everything ended when her car plunged down a hill in the accident the Carter family never spoke of again. Now I couldn't stop myself from thinking, was that death tied to this money? And why had my father mentioned my mother when leaving me this secret fortune? I opened a desk drawer and took out an old album I'd kept. Inside were only a handful of photographs of her, one where she held me in the park, one where she stood at the door of our old house in Boston. I ran my fingers over her face in the picture and whispered, "Mom, I have to find out the truth. I need to know why Father did this, and why you're the key to all of it." Outside, car horns echoed through the night, and the streetlights cast a dull golden glow across the room. I sat alone, caught between two realities. One Isabel, poor and publicly humiliated at the will reading, and another Isabel who had just discovered she held a fortune capable of changing everything. Between those two versions of myself, the only thread connecting them was the relentless question, why had my father chosen me? That night I hardly slept. The figure $127 million flashed in my mind like a light that refused to go out. But more haunting than the number was the message. Your mother knew why. If my mother knew the reason, then everything had to begin with her death. I decided I would go back, search for every trace left behind from the accident that had taken her life when I was only 3 years old. The next morning, I called in to take the day off, pulled on an old coat, and boarded a train to Boston, the place where the accident records were kept. On the way, my heart pounded as if I were stepping into a play whose script had already been written, except I had not yet reached the final act. The administrative building where homicide and accident files were stored was old, the air heavy with the smell of aged paper mixed with rusted metal. I filled out the request form, my hand trembling as I wrote the name. Laura Miller, 1999. The clerk looked at me with a measuring stare before disappearing into the archives. Half an hour later, she returned and laid a thin but weighty file onto the desk. I opened it, the yellowed pages revealing the words, Case No. 11478, Vehicle Accident. The detailed report stated that my mother's car had plunged down a hill on the outskirts, the brakes having completely failed. But what froze me to the core was a red underlined note. Brake line appeared intentionally severed, further investigation recommended, potential homicide. I sat paralyzed, my eyes locked on the words. So from the very beginning, the police had suspected this was no accident. They had been prepared to pursue it as a homicide case, but at the end of the file was a short memorandum. Investigation closed per request of Richard Carter. Cause of death officially listed as accident. I read that line again and again, my mind in turmoil. My father, Richard, the man who had abandoned me my entire life, he was the one who asked for the investigation to be shut down. Why? What was he afraid of? Who was he protecting? I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, childhood memories flooding in. I remembered once, as a little girl, I had overheard Eleanor furiously arguing with Richard in the living room. Her voice was sharp, cutting. She must never set foot in this house. Laura is nothing but a stain you foolishly brought into our lives. I will not let her take my place. Back then, I hadn't understood the meaning of those words, only the sight of Eleanor's face, flushed red, her eyes burning with hatred. Now, linking that fragment of memory to the file in my hands, I shuddered at the realization. Eleanor had every motive to want my mother gone. The more I thought, the more the pieces aligned in a terrifying way. Eleanor had always treated me as a burden, a living reminder that Richard had once loved another woman. She had never hidden her contempt for my mother. I remembered the rare family gatherings when, if someone happened to mention Laura's name, Eleanor would immediately change the subject or drop a cruel remark. What's worth saying about someone like that? I would sit in silence, but deep down, I knew she hated my mother more than anyone else ever could. I closed the file, my hands trembling with rage. All these years, my mother's death had not been fate but the result of a conspiracy. And the one who requested the case be closed, my father, was involved. Yet deep down, I felt Richard was not the culprit. He might have stayed silent out of fear, pressure, or because of a force far greater than I had ever imagined. And when I recalled Eleanor's eyes at the funeral, that triumphant gleam as if she still held everything in her grasp, a chill ran down my spine. On the train ride back to New York, I stared out at the rushing scenery, a fierce determination rising inside me. I needed to dig deeper, to uncover why Eleanor wielded such immense power. Power strong enough to force Richard into shutting down a murder case. Since childhood, I had sensed that Eleanor was not merely the wealthy wife behind Richard. She had a way of making people obey, from household staff to Carter Industries business partners. Richard might have been the boss on paper, but I believed the true power had always rested with Eleanor. When I arrived at my apartment, I set the file on the table and stared at the red underlined words. Break line severed. The picture was becoming clear. My mother had been murdered. Richard knew, but chose to conceal it. Eleanor had the motive, the influence, and for years had openly despised my mother. Inside me, a voice grew louder. Eleanor Blackwood knew more than she had ever admitted. She was the key. And if I wanted to uncover the truth, I would have to start by exposing the real woman behind Eleanor, the one who had destroyed my childhood and stolen my mother from me. My phone rang on a gray Monday morning. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar international number, beginning with the code +41. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. On the other end was a deep male voice, precise, with a faint German inflection. Hello, this is Hinrich Ducker, Senior Manager at Zurich Liberty Bank. I need to speak with you, Isabel Carter. At the mention of the bank's name, my heart nearly stopped. That was the very place holding the secret $127 million I had just discovered. I replied softly, trying to keep my composure. Yes, this is me, but how do you know who I am? And how did you get my number? The man paused briefly, then said, Miss Carter, I was entrusted by Mr. Richard Carter. Before his death, he left instructions that once you accessed the account, we were to contact you immediately. There are things he wanted you to know, but could not say while he was alive. His voice carried no hint of deception. I sat upright, my entire body going cold. Ducker suggested we continue through a secure video channel. Within minutes, my laptop screen displayed the image of a man in his 60s, silver-haired but with sharp, unwavering eyes. He inclined his head in greeting before beginning to speak. Isabel, you have probably always wondered why you lived on the margins of the Carter family. The truth is, your mother, Laura Miller, was not just an ordinary woman. She was once an undercover FBI agent, embedded to investigate illegal operations within Carter Industries. I was stunned. All my life, I had only known my mother through hazy memories and a handful of old photographs, a gentle woman with kind blue eyes. I had never imagined she had once been an agent. No, that can't be, I whispered. But Ducker went on. This is a classified file the FBI kept sealed for years. Under Richard's leadership, Carter Industries became entangled in money laundering networks and clandestine finance. Laura was assigned to infiltrate, to get close to Richard and gather evidence. But everything changed when she truly fell in love with him, and then became pregnant with you. End quote. I clutched my head, my heart pounding wildly. Everything was spinning. My mother, an FBI agent? And me the result of a mission gone off plan? Ducker nodded, as if he could feel the shock I was going through. When she discovered she was pregnant, Laura chose to withdraw from the mission. She didn't want her child born into a storm. But at that very moment, her enemies found out. He paused, eyes fixed on the camera. The order to eliminate her did not come from Richard, but from Eleanor Blackwood. The name Eleanor landed like a hammer blow to my chest. I stopped breathing, my palms icy. Ducker continued. Eleanor was not merely Richard's wife. She was the covert leader, the one running the dark financial network behind Carter Industries. Richard was only the legal facade. Eleanor learned Laura was an agent, and when Laura tried to leave, she saw her as a threat. The order was given, remove her. And the accident in 1999 was the result. I listened as if slipping into another realm. All the fragments I had once suspected now clicked perfectly into place: the file about the severed brake line, the memories of Eleanor's jealousy, my father's fearful silence. Everything led to one point. Eleanor. Not just a cruel stepmother, but the woman who had destroyed my mother's life and hidden the truth for decades. And what about Vanessa? I asked, my voice trembling. Ducker's expression grew solemn. Vanessa is Eleanor's biological daughter. She was raised to be the legitimate heir, a shield to maintain Eleanor's grip on power. But in truth, Eleanor is the one pulling the strings. Vanessa is only a pawn, unaware of the full extent of her mother's crimes. I sat in silence as tears streamed down my face. For so many years I had blamed Richard for his coldness, for abandoning me. Now I understood he had lived under constant fear. He knew the truth about Eleanor, knew she had killed Laura, but if he dared to defy her, my life would have been in danger. Perhaps that was why he kept his distance, to protect me from the gaze of the murderer disguised as a high society lady. Ducker sent over another digital file. Records, financial documents, and photographs linking Eleanor directly to global money laundering operations. Richard secretly transferred these to me. He wanted you, when you were strong enough, to learn the truth and choose your own path. The $127 million are not tainted funds. They're a trust Laura and Richard created to protect you, to give you freedom, even while Eleanor controlled everything else. I stared at the screen in shock. My world had turned upside down. Grief and fury surged through me all at once. Eleanor Blackwood, the woman who had stolen my mother, destroyed my childhood, and built a sanctified facade around the Carter Empire, was now revealed as the mastermind of crime. The call ended, but I remained frozen before the dark screen. My breath came in sharp bursts, my heart hammering with each beat. I knew that from this moment on, there was no way back. I was holding in my hands the key to unlock the darkest secrets of all. And I swore to myself I would not allow my mother's death to be buried one more day. I had thought I would hate Richard Carter forever, the father who only watched from a distance, letting me grow up in loneliness and humiliation. But after the call from Zurich, the layers of the veil began to lift. I realized the distance he built between us was not entirely indifference or contempt, but a wall of protection he had been forced to erect to shield me from Eleanor's darkness. I returned to the file Ducker had sent, reading and rereading every page. There were internal FBI memos, anonymous letters sent from untraceable addresses, all bearing the same electronic signature matching Richard's. In them, he provided information about suspicious Carter Industries transactions, vast sums funneled into tax havens. He never appeared as the whistleblower himself, but the repeated phrase, internal source, said everything. Richard was both the man steering the empire and the secret betrayer in the shadows, living with two faces every day. I reeled back into memories of my childhood. The long dinners where he sat at the head of the table, rigid, eyes always avoiding mine. I had once believed that look held shame, that I was the illegitimate child. But now I understood. Perhaps every time he looked at me, he feared Eleanor would notice some flicker of affection he still held for me. He chose silence and coldness because if he showed closeness, Eleanor would immediately suspect. In that ruthless game of power, I had unknowingly become his most dangerous vulnerability. Ducker's files also mentioned a special fund, one that began in 1998, right after Laura became pregnant with me. The first transfers came from an unknown source, but after that Richard added to it steadily. The cold numbers in the account ledger suddenly felt heavy. They weren't just figures, they were evidence of a father's fear and determination. He had known Eleanor could strike at any time, and that money was the only insurance for my survival. I trembled as memories returned of being left alone in the maid's room, of eating with the staff in the kitchen while Vanessa shone at the dining table. Back then, all I had felt was shame and pain. But now I understood every distance, every invisibility he imposed on me had been a layer of disguise. Eleanor would never allow anyone to threaten her position or her daughters. If I had been publicly acknowledged, if Richard had openly protected me, perhaps I would not be alive to tell this story now. But the truth did not erase the ache. I still felt a knot in my throat when I remembered the years I had begged silently for a hug, a word of praise, and received only a cold, distant glance. I whispered to myself, "Father, why didn't you believe I was strong enough to know the truth? Why did you let me endure it all alone?" The question drifted into the night, unanswered, leaving only the sound of wind slipping through the window of my small apartment. Among the papers lay one final note, Richard's signature clear at the bottom. "If my daughter finds this, tell her that I have always seen Laura in her." I kept my distance not because I did not love her, but because I loved her too much. Eleanor would never spare her if she knew I still cared. The only way to protect her was to let her believe she was only a shadow. I read those lines over and over until tears blurred the ink. All those years of hatred, all those years wondering if I was worth anything, everything boiled down to one bitter truth. He loved me, but that love had been chained by fear of Eleanor. Looking back, I saw Richard like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, brilliant on the outside, but full of invisible wounds within. He had lived his whole life compromising, maintaining enough power to avoid being cast aside, while secretly feeding fragments of evidence to the FBI, hoping one day the truth would emerge. But he had not been brave enough to break the chains himself. All he could do was leave it for me, the child he had once deliberately pushed out of the light, but to whom he had secretly entrusted the future of the truth. I sat alone in my cramped Brooklyn apartment, the thick FBI files spread before me, the laptop screen still glowing with the figure $127 million. Never in my life had I felt so starkly caught between two worlds. On one side, that vast sum promised a life I had never dared dream of. A seaside mansion, trips around the world, doors opening with a single click. On the other side, pages steeped in blood, Ducker's voice echoing in my mind. Laura Miller was murdered on the orders of Eleanor Blackwood. And I knew my mother, the gentle woman I remembered only through a few faded images, deserved more than any fortune ever could. Vanessa's image filled my mind, her elegant black dress at the funeral, her self-satisfied smile as she accepted an empire worth $18 million. I had once envied her, once hated her because I was never allowed to stand in the light. But now, with the truth revealed, I no longer saw a perfect sister. I saw a puppet. Vanessa was nothing more than a flower Eleanor had placed on the altar of power, a cover to hide the bloodstained lineage and the hands that had killed my mother. That empire was not an inheritance, it was evidence of a crime. And if I chose silence, I would be helping Eleanor keep her grip on everything. Two paths appeared before me. The first, I could stay silent, keep the $127 million, disappear from Eleanor's sight, and live a comfortable life anywhere in the world. Switzerland, Italy, Even a small house on the California coast. No one would know. No one would bother me. I could start over, leave the past behind. The second, I could step into the light, reveal the entire truth, hand the files to the FBI, and force Eleanor and even Vanessa to face justice. But that path meant putting myself in danger. Eleanor was not someone who sat still. She had money, connections, and an entire criminal network behind her. I asked myself, which path would my mother want me to choose? If she were alive, would Laura want me safe, or would she want me to finish the mission she never could? I opened the only photo I still had of her standing in front of our old Boston house, holding me as a little girl. Her eyes stared straight into the lens, gentle yet unyielding. I knew the answer was there, in that gaze. My mother had been an FBI agent. She had chosen to sacrifice herself to protect the truth. I was her daughter. I could not betray that ideal out of fear. I remembered the final words of the will Finch had read aloud. Blood defines lineage, but character defines worth. You will receive exactly what you deserve. At the time, I had thought it was nothing more than a bitter, cutting phrase. But now I understood. Richard knew I would have a choice, and what I deserved was not to live quietly off money, but to face the truth and decide with my own character. I stood up and began pacing the small room. Fear crept in. If I failed, Eleanor could have me eliminated the way she had my mother. But at the same time, a fire flared inside me. I had spent my whole life in the shadows, branded the child nobody wanted, mocked and discarded. This was the first time I had the chance to turn the board, and I swore I would not waste it. I reopened my laptop and typed an encrypted email to Ducker. I choose justice. Tell me the next step. My fingers trembled as I hit send, but immediately afterward a strange calm washed over me. I knew this path would be full of danger, but at least I was no longer the invisible child in the maid's room. I was Isabel Carter, daughter of Laura Miller. And I would not let my mother's death remain buried another day. I closed the laptop and stepped out onto the balcony. The New York night lay beneath me, neon lights glowing, traffic humming, the scent of gasoline carried in the wind. I drew a deep breath. For the first time in years, I felt my body trembling, not from fear, but from strength rising inside me. From this moment on, my life would no longer be dictated by Eleanor or Vanessa. The choice was mine, and I had chosen justice. From the moment I sent the email to Ducker, I knew I had stepped onto a road with no way back. In the days that followed, I lived strung tight as a wire. I locked every door, checked the security cameras multiple times, and always carried a can of pepper spray in my bag. But fear no longer paralyzed me the way it once had. It had become fuel, a reminder that I was moving closer to the truth Eleanor had tried to bury for more than 2 decades. The first thing I did was separate a portion of the assets from Eleanor's shadow. That night I logged into the Zurich account, my hand shaking as I entered the amount, $10 million. I transferred it into a private account in my name at a U.S. bank, an account Ducker had securely set up. When the transaction completed, I let out a breath. That was my safety net. If everything collapsed, at least I had a future to hold on to. But the remaining sum, $117 million, I left untouched. It was not for me. It was evidence, my mother's legacy, the blade I was about to drive straight into the heart of the empire Eleanor had built. I spent the entire week organizing the documents Ducker had sent. Hundreds of pages of financial reports, transaction invoices, internal memoranda, and scattered testimonies from anonymous sources. I numbered everything, arranged it, and finally compressed it into an encrypted digital dossier. I knew I could not defeat Eleanor alone. She had a network, and I was just one person. So I sent the entire file to a confidential FBI address Ducker provided. In the email I wrote briefly, "My name is Isabel Carter. This is evidence of illegal financial activity by Carter Industries under the direction of Eleanor Blackwood. I request protection and, above all, I request justice for Laura Miller." 2 days later, the FBI made contact. One morning, while I sat in my usual Brooklyn cafe, 2 men in suits approached my table. They didn't need to show me a badge. I knew immediately where they were from. One of them spoke quietly. "We received the file. You did the right thing." Those words left me trembling and strangely relieved. After so many years, someone was finally on my side. The operation unfolded faster than I ever imagined. Perhaps it was because the FBI had already been quietly monitoring Carter Industries for years, and what I provided was simply the final piece that completed the puzzle. I wasn't told the details, but from the scattered hints, I understood that the net had already been cast wide. And then, the fateful morning arrived. The news exploded like a bomb. I sat frozen in front of the television, watching live images from Rhode Island. Dozens of FBI agents stormed the Newport mansion, black SUVs blocking every entrance. Eleanor, dressed in a silk sapphire gown, still tried to hold her haughty composure, but her wrists were bound in gleaming handcuffs. Vanessa screamed hysterically, her face twisted in fear, as she was dragged out the front gates under the flashing cameras of dozens of reporters. The anchor's voice rang out. "The FBI has just dismantled a large-scale illegal financial network tied to Carter Industries. This is considered the biggest organized crime case in years." My throat tightened. All my life I had dreamed of this moment, the moment Eleanor would bow her head, the moment Vanessa's arrogance would finally crumble. Yet, when it truly happened, I didn't feel wild triumph. Instead, a deep sadness washed over me. Because behind the flashing cameras, behind the shouting and the click of handcuffs, I saw the shadow of my mother, the woman who had died in silence so that justice could finally be named today. The news spread across every headline. Carter Empire collapses, high society queen exposed as criminal mastermind. Arrest shakes business elite. Articles detailed how the FBI froze all assets, the Newport mansion, the luxury yachts, the collection of supercars all seized. Even the $18 million Vanessa had inherited from the will was immediately frozen. The glamorous images of Eleanor and Vanessa, once seated in the front row of galas, were now replaced by photographs of them in orange prison jumpsuits, handcuffed, heads bowed before the court. I sat alone in my apartment, watching the broadcast, my breath coming fast and shallow. I had done what my father had never dared to do. I had dragged Eleanor into the light, shattered the flawless mask she had worn to rule over everything. But at what cost? I knew that somewhere out there, those still loyal to her might be seething, might be plotting revenge. I had no illusion that the danger was over. Yet, for the first time in my life, I felt my mother was no longer forgotten. After everything, I left New York on a quiet winter night. The glowing streets, the familiar car horns, I knew I would miss them, but I also understood they were bound to shadows and painful memories. I needed a new beginning, a place where I could breathe freely without being haunted by the name Carter. And so, I chose Switzerland, the land my mother had once dreamed of, where still waters reflected snow-capped mountains, where my parents' secret had once been safeguarded inside a bank account. Life began, simply. I rented a small apartment overlooking Lake Geneva. By day, I worked alongside young local architects, taking on modest interior design projects. By night, I walked along the lake, letting the cold wind sting my face and remind me that I was still alive, still free to choose how I lived. But I refused to let my life be only for myself. From the weight of loss, I understood the pain of children robbed of their parents by crime. I decided to create a foundation, named the Laura Foundation, in my mother's memory. It would support children who had lost parents to violence, scholarships, safe housing, and above all, arms ready to hold them, the very thing I had once longed for but never received. I used part of the profits from my work and my private investments to run the Laura Foundation. But I never touched the $127 million, even though it remained in the Zurich account. As the years passed, the number grew steadily with interest and safe investments managed by Ducker. One day, I looked at the screen and saw it had surpassed $200 million USD. I laughed, a sound both relieved and bitter. I had never needed that money to prove my worth. I only needed to know it existed, as proof that my parents, in their own way, had tried to protect me even when they were gone. Each year, like a ritual, Heinrich Ducker would call. His face grew older, but his eyes remained sharp. "Miss Isabel," he asked, "do you want to claim the entire sum now? It is yours, legally, and every restriction has expired." I smiled and shook my head. "I already have enough, Mr. Ducker. I have a home, a job I love, and a foundation that carries my mother's name. That's all I need." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded, as if he understood that my real strength was not in the number on the bank screen, but in my ability to choose not to be ruled by it. From time to time, the media still mentioned the fall of Carter Industries as a landmark in the fight against financial crime. My name rarely appeared, and I wanted it that way. I didn't need glory, I only wanted quiet peace. Eleanor Blackwood and Vanessa had become names tied forever to disgrace, imprisoned, their wealth stripped away. But I chose a different path, not more revenge, but healing. I would never forget that my mother had fallen for the truth, and I knew the best way to honor her was not to live in hatred, but to use freedom to create meaning. One summer afternoon, I sat by the lakeshore with a group of children from the Laura Foundation, listening to their laughter as they played tag. A little blonde girl, no more than 7, suddenly hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for giving me a family." I was choked with emotion as I held her close. In that moment, I realized the greatest inheritance was not the money my parents left behind, but the ability to turn my pain into light for others. And so, my story closes with a simple truth that took me a lifetime to learn. The real inheritance is not the wealth parents leave behind, but the freedom to choose how you live. I am no longer the child nobody wanted. I am no longer invisible. I am Isabel Carter, the daughter of Laura Miller, and I have rewritten my own destiny. The final scene I want to keep in my memory. A quiet evening by Lake Geneva. The sky fades into a soft violet, the breeze rippling gently across the water. I walk along the shore, letting the chill brush through my hair, and whisper, "Mom, I did it. And I am free."